If Christians were serious about persecution and who's actually persecuting Christians throughout the history of Christianity since it first began in and around the first century, then what they would not be looking at is videos like mine or others who have go out and use Christian deconstruction. What they will look at is their own history and see who actually persecuted Christians. Now, some Christians will look at the time frame of the early Roman emperors during the time frame from Nero up through 325, 318 actually, with Constantine, and they will focus in on Nero and Domitian and those Roman emperors who did, by all accounts, persecute Christians. Which is why in your books of the Gospels and Revelations, when it talks about Christian persecution, when it talks about two would be in the field and one would be taken, two would be in the household and one would be taken, it is not actually speaking on what has happened since Christianity took over pretty much the world through European colonization after 318 at the Edict of Milan. Yes, Christians were persecuted, as written by Pliny the Younger, Tacitus in the second century CE. And then there are other forms of persecution that happened under different Roman emperors thereafter. But we see that after we get into more around the second, third, fourth century, that Christians weren't persecuted by the Roman government as much, seeing as how there were Christians who were in the Roman armies of Maxentius as well as Constantine by the time we get to the the union of the Roman Empire by Constantine after defeating Maxentius in Moldavia at the Moldavian Bridge. At 318 CE, when Constantine, at the Edict of Milan, made Christianity a legal religion within the Roman Empire, we see that the persecution of Christianity relatively ceases from any factions outside of other Christians. Christians still persecuted one another because of different rhetorics to which was being taught throughout the Christian world, throughout Rome, the Middle East, and North Africa. But once we get to the Council of Nicaea in 325, when it went out through the Roman Empire that Orthodox Christianity was going to be the favored style of Christianity by the Roman government, supported by the army, then Christian persecution was then done by fellow Christians. The greatest persecution of Christians happened by fellow Christians. 382 CE, under Theodosius, when Christianity was made the only religion for the Roman Empire, all Christians who were then persecuted were Gnostics, were Marcions, or Nestorians. Those were the types of Christians who had different viewpoints of Christianity, different viewpoints on who and what Jesus was. That's when Christianity felt its most oppression by other Christians in the Roman Empire. After that, we see a long history of Christian persecution by other Christians who differed from the Roman government, from what became Catholicism, up until 1500s. All that time prior to the 1500s, all the Dark Ages, all the Inquisitions, we're talking about tens of millions of Christians being persecuted by other Christians. If you went outside of them and was declared heresy, it was other Christians who persecuted the other Christians. After the 1500s, when Martin Luther nailed his grievances on the door, supposedly, then another form of Christian persecution began to happen, the difference between Catholic persecution and Protestant persecution. This was initiated because different kingdoms start to flip over to Protestantism. And as they flip to Protestantism back and forth, as we saw with England, where we have Henry VIII, who went over to Protestantism for the sake so that he can divorce his wife and then try to have a son with another wife. He then persecuted Catholicism in England, and then later Mary comes up. She's known as Bloody Mary, not because she fought battles, but because of her persecution of Protestant Christians, pushing them back to Catholicism. And then James in the 1600s, early 1600s, goes back to Protestantism. But even in his Protestant stance, he was persecuting those who would become the Pilgrims and the Puritans who left so that they can come to the Americas and worship freely, because they were being persecuted by the Protestant church as well as the Catholic church during those eras. Now, of indigenous people, who persecuted them? The West African colonization after Pope Alexander the Fourth and Pope Nicholas the Fifth, or Pope Alexander the Sixth and Pope Nicholas the Fifth, formalized persecution of indigenous people who were non-Christians throughout West Africa and then into the Americas as the age of colonization began, and then later into India with the persecution of the Hindu and Muslim people in India after that time frame. So the majority of persecution of Christians happened from other Christians. It's estimated around 50 million Christians who were persecuted after 318 occurred by other Christians. So in today's world, when Christians claim to be persecuted, they are not being persecuted by anyone outside of other Christians. There is not an onslaught of Christians who are dying today, who are being persecuted today. If you call questioning your religion persecution, you're looking at a very thin veil of it and not looking at what true persecution is. No one's being nailed to a cross. No one's being choked out for having the Holy Ghost. No one is being killed for wearing certain clothing. No one's being put into witch trials, to which the Salem witch trial was the most minor, when there was more witch trials that were happening on the European continent than were happening on the American continent. So most of your persecution was done by other Christians. Today, we just simply question whether or not your religion is true and whether there are facts enough to back it up, and we choose not to believe it. We're not persecuting you. We're not going out and coming and knocking on your door trying to convince you not to be Christian. We're not standing on street corners trying to convince you not to be Christian. We're not going to your churches and interrupting your services trying to convince you not to be Christian, but yet it is Christians who are knocking on people's doors, who are going to other people's assemblies, who are aimlessly walking up to people and trying to tell them about their Messiah and doing all other sorts of rude things that if we did it, you would then have a complaint. But yet you think it's okay for you to do it because your book says you are to go out and preach to the whole world. But understand, when the people decide they did not want to listen to Jesus, whether or not when he casted out the demons from the man and they ran into pigs and ran out the cliff, they asked him to leave. He left and didn't bother them again. When he tried to go home to Nazareth, they looked at him like, you Joseph, little boy. He left. The prophet cannot go home. So when we don't want to listen to you, when we ask the question, why are you on our pages? Just leave and be like Jesus. Because wear the bracelet. What would Jesus do? But we are not persecuting you. You are doing the persecution. And in your history, the majority of the persecution came from your fellow Christians who had a disagreement based on the type of Christianity that they were serving and the type of Christianity that you serve. And whoever had the biggest military or government backing, those are the ones who won. But have a great day. Always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibration.